world has now shrunk back to the borders of Russia at the beginning of the reign of Peter the Great. And of course, as we know, NATO expanded to Russia's borders. Now, it didn't expand because it was pushed by the West. It expanded basically because the countries in that part of the world wanted it to, and they wanted protection. Same reason the Ukrainians now clamor to be let in. The Poles, among all, primarily, and the Baltic countries, the Czechs. And the new members wanted protection. Ukraine and Georgia applied in 2008, and those applications were accepted, but never acted on by NATO, and that's been 14 years. So you can't say this war was ticked off by something that happened yesterday if you're looking at that kind of an explanation. And of course, it's still expanding. Finland and Sweden just joined essentially in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, the other thing that's in the recent antecedents is that you had these so-called color revolutions in former parts of the Soviet Union. And the Russians saw this, some Russians at least, as Western subversion to overthrow governments friendly to Russia. It's an interesting inversion because it's like our view of communist subversion during the Cold War. You had the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003. You had an uprising in Ukraine in 2004 against a phony election, which threw out the government, phonily elected government of Yanukovych, same guy who was thrown out in 2014, changed the government there. And then you had demonstrations in Russia itself in 2007 and 2011, big ones. And Putin accused the US State Department and specifically Hillary Clinton of masterminding these protests. It really is no wonder what the Russians were up to in the 2016 election. And then, of course, you got the big one. You got the Ukrainian Revolution, and it really was, in 2014. And it was ticked off when Yanukovych, again president, elected democratically, decided he was going to short circuit the Ukrainian application to become an associate of the European Union. And by then, Ukrainians were clearly, they were developing a very strong national identity and they wanted to move west. Yanukovych said, no, we're going to sign up with Russia and Putin instead in their economic union. And if you'll pardon me, all hell broke loose. It did. Take a look at the pictures. This is what it looked like in the middle of the fuss. And the Russians, of course, were told by their Putin government, made in America is Moscow next. Well, they went on to annex Crimea, and it was framed as a choice between Ukrainian Nazis and Russia. That framing of the Nazis versus Russia goes back to 2014. Also, talk of annexing Novorossiya, New Russia. That also started in 2014. And if you look at Novorossiya, and if you look at the Russian language speaking areas of Ukraine, it looks very much like, it's almost exactly the same as those places Putin is trying to annex this week. So that goes back. By the way, don't be confused by the difference between Russian speakers and Russians. A lot of Canadians speak English. That doesn't mean they want to join the United States. Who wants what in that part of the world is very confused, but it is simply not the case that if somebody is a native Russian speaker at home, they would prefer to live under a Russian state rather than a Ukrainian one. In fact, in the current invasion, it's pretty clear that not that many people want that in those areas. And here's the 2014 view of Ukraine by the Russians then and now. Puppet of the Americans, it's not a real government. As we know, Ukraine is not a real country. Next bit of background. Putin and his worldview. This is Peter the Great on his rock in front of the Imperial building in St. Petersburg, statue erected by Catherine II. The inscription reads, by the way, in Latin letters from Catherine II to Peter I, The statue was cast by the French sculptor Falconet. And it represents the mighty Russian state of autocracy and power. A lot of Russian literature about that, about the statue and how it pursues citizens. Now, Americans don't really get Putin because the Russian political culture is quite different from ours. He's a very traditional Russian ruler. He's a государственник. Государство in Russian means the state or the government. Putin is a man of the state. And if you look at everything he's done, his goal is quite simple. It's restore and expand the power of the Russian state. Now, the Russian state is not national in the ethnic national Western sense. It's always ruled over many different peoples. Russia itself is a multi-ethnic, multicultural country. The top leadership of the Russian state has always included, under the czars, under the communists, and now people who are not ethnic Russians. And there is a whole set of traditions of the Russian state. And this, by the way, except for the one about the church, all of them continued through the Soviet period. Control the citizens, you suppress dissent, you hold military power as your trump card in the world. You're opposed to the predominant Western power, whatever it is. Sometimes they invade you and then you have to repel them. And sometimes you expand into their turf to prevent them from attacking you. The distinction between offense and defense gets lost. Very relevant to the current situation. The Russian state always has depended on resource exports to Europe: gold, honey, wax, furs, wheat, oil, gas. The Russian state and its leaders oppose and reject Western liberal ideology. The economic elite and the church are subordinate to the state and defend its interests. And Russia has very often an ideological mission in the world. This is true under the czars and obviously under the communists. And to a certain extent, it's also true under Putin, who is a conservative. He's like the 19th century czars. He's going to root out liberalism and decadence. Here's the closest analog: Tsar Nicholas I, second quarter of the 19th century, autocracy, the Orthodox faith, and nationalism. And here's Putin coming out with the Russian imperial seal behind him and St. George. The soldiers are opening the door and the courtiers are waiting. Kiss the icon. Nothing new here. Patriarch Kirill is not just an admirer, but a servant of Putin. He's blessed wars in Syria, and now he's blessed the war in Ukraine. You build up military power. This was just after the Crimea annexation. Victory Day, April the 9th. And Russians developed a worldview of Putin: steady, clever, competent, wise, and tough. Why? Well, he presided over prosperity, not because of his economic policies, but because of the vast increase in the world oil price, supplying government revenues, which began just in the year 2000 when he took power. But anyway, they like this kind of a leader. Many do. Now, what actually is Putin's worldview? The West is the enemy. Its advance must be reversed, starting in Ukraine. Belarusians, Ukrainians, Great Russians are one people within, quote, the Russian world, end quote, and it's never quite clear where the borders of the Russian world begin or end or whatnot. It's a very ambiguous notion, always has been. Think of the gathering of the Russian lands way back when and ever since. Ukraine is not a real country. Putin accepts and furthers the idea of the strong state to control citizens, resources, exports, and eradicate Western influence, which, as I pointed out, is traditional Russian. Strong military, absolutely. And Putin perceives, or says he perceives, that the West is in decline, liberalism is dead, and a strong man upholding religion and traditional values is the ascendant world ideology. And he is the leader. And I think you have a whole list of people who would fall into that category, including Donald Trump, Orban, Erdogan, Modi, Xi Jinping, Bolsonaro, Duterte. You can go on with your list. This is what's coming in the world. Liberalism is dead and gone. So what do? You ally with China, you try to divide the Europeans and split the Americans away. Once you've got a whole handle on this idea of being a man of the state and the worldview, a whole lot of things, frankly, become clear in a way they generally weren't before. Now, Putin has this long table. I just can't resist showing this picture. Here he is with question mark. At the other end from question mark, Emmanuel Macron, representing obviously a leader of the West. And in terms of the West, Russia published, the Russian Foreign Ministry officially, it's on their website. I have copies, it's there. Draft treaties in December 2021. They'd already decided to invade Ukraine, but they published these draft treaties. And this is what they wanted. It's a set of geopolitical aims. It's one treaty with NATO, another one with the United States. And among the things they say, NATO forces will leave all the countries east of Germany, restoring the situation of 1991. The Russians said 1997, but that's the year before the first expansion of NATO. No new NATO members, no Ukraine, no Georgia, no nobody that isn't in already. No NATO or US military activity in that Russian world. Ukraine, South Caucasus, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe. The US will do nothing to undermine the, quote, core security interests of Russia, and the US will withdraw all nuclear weapons to its own national territory. A bunch of other things as well. But the takeaway is this, that control over Ukraine would not and will not end Putin's quest to secure Russian interests, empire, quote, in Europe. This is what's actually on the table. Okay, he gave a belligerent speech on February 21st of this year, and by the way, faulted Lenin and the communists for creating national republics, including Ukraine, so just dividing the whole thing up into administrative territories, the way the late Tsars had done, and then he invaded on the 24th. Now, very clear, they expected a replay of Crimea in 2014. You'd install a new pro-Russian government, you would add Ukraine to the Russia-Belarus Union and eventually amalgamate them all. You annex Donbass on the southern coast, so-called Novorossiya. You go ahead and denazify, that is, root out everybody who's anti-Russian. Talk more about that in Ukraine. And I would argue, by the way, this is still the Russian plan, except regime change in Kiev has been delayed. We hope it will not happen. Now, was Putin told by his advisors that an invasion would be quick, successful, painless, a short, victorious war? A fait accompli that nobody could really object to. Very old story. A recent one. Remember Mission Accomplished after the invasion of Iraq? That was another short, victorious war and invading another country that didn't go the way it was supposed to. I mean, history's littered with these things. And can anybody tell Putin what he doesn't want to hear? It's not clear. He keeps his distance from everybody and everything, including perhaps his own military and the Siloviki, the power guys who were his close associates. I'm not sure that Putin at this point or ever really trusts anyone. We don't know. We don't know at that level. Now, the invasion of Ukraine had three miscalculations. First one was military. They assumed the Russian army would be superior, be in Kiev in a week, won all our recent campaigns. Nationalism and resistance of the Ukrainians. How much do you think that Putin and the others around him believed their own propaganda, that these were really just little Russians waiting to be liberated from their puppet Nazi government? I don't know. I can't get inside their heads. But they certainly assumed more of that than was the case. And Zelensky. I mean, who is this guy? Amateur clown. He's a former comedian. Get rid of him and a bunch of oligarchs will take over temporarily, and we know all those guys, and we can sort of twist the situation around, maybe just install our own people directly. Sidebar on nationalism. Sometimes it fools you. Sometimes it grows very, very quickly. Now, if you had done this sort of thing, maybe not with these methods in 1993 or 4 or 5 or even in 2000, you wouldn't have had the same reaction from Ukrainians. The events of 2004, of 2014, where they were putting out "We hate Putin" signs, Putin all over the place, and since helped create a strong Ukrainian anti-Russian nationalism that simply wasn't there, at least not to that extent, historically. To the extent it did, it was in the western part of the country and so on. You want a parallel for this rapid creation of nationalism? I'll give you one. You remember that in 1763, a Virginia colonel named George Washington led a contingent of colonial militia in support of British troops and King George III in Western Pennsylvania, where they all got killed. Except Washington and his militia. They were better than the British regulars. That's 1763. Fast forward 13 years, and that same person is now the head of the Continental Army, expelling King George III and the British from North America. And that's just one person. You can multiply that by a very large majority of the English inhabitants of the colonies. That's another case, and it's one that Americans are familiar with. There are others as well. So they didn't get Ukrainian nationalism, and they certainly didn't get Western solidarity. They expected disunity and division. Germany would value its gas more than anything else. The European Union would split, and the Americans wouldn't really do much. Biden was weak. He just totally screwed up in Afghanistan. He's incompetent. Trump Republicans will block action. You put it all together, the West really isn't going to do anything about this. We'll have an easy victory. No, flip. All these expectations were shared by US and Western analysts. You can go back and read them. And the United States actually moved its entire embassy out of Kiev to southern Poland before the invasion, which we knew was coming and which our intelligence had made public and publicized. There's the old saying about chicken Kiev. Well, this was chicken Kiev. But we expected that the Russian plan would go the way the Russians thought it would. Now, come on, Vladimir, why don't you just come with us? We'll keep you safe, said the Americans. And you got one of the famous lines of the 21st century. I need ammunition, not a ride. And by the way, I would point out sometimes individuals and their decisions really do matter. And I think this was one of them. Now, what happened after that surprised everybody. The Russian armor never reached Kiev. And they were thrown back by small Ukrainian units sporting Javelin anti-tank missiles, Stingers to shoot down the helicopters provided by the United States and NATO, who'd given some military aid and training to the Ukrainians, by the way, before the invasion, which nobody had quite noticed. That's not the only reason the Ukrainians did well, but it's a minor one and it's important. They never got there. And that, of course, changed a whole lot of things. This clearly wasn't going to be a short, victorious war. So Zelensky launched his Zoom tour of Western capitals. Here he is speaking to the US Congress on March 16th, which is 3 weeks after the invasion, less than 3 weeks, 20 days after the invasion. And I was going to show you a video clip, but it's too complicated on Zoom with an audience and so on. I don't know, how many of you saw Zelensky's speech to the Congress? Only a couple of you. Well, Zelensky did his bit. We need your help. We need a no-fly zone, which the United States always rejected because it would have meant a direct confrontation between US and Russian, which we ruled out, wisely, I think. But it also showed scenes of Ukraine contrasting peaceful people walking baby strollers through parks, you know, going about their business, sitting on park benches, going to amusement parks, just living this wonderful, normal life. And then you got these scenes of buildings being shelled and falling down and, you know, people being killed and babies crying and all the rest of it. It was a very, very powerful piece of, if you will excuse me, war propaganda. Doesn't mean, by the way, propaganda doesn't mean it's not true. It just means it's very carefully designed to persuade and make a point. Most of this, in fact, all of it, as far as I know, was true. And these presentations had a great deal of effect. Information war is a subject that's going to be studied in this case for quite a while. One sidelight of these early months that I want to mention, the Russians have a Black Sea fleet. The Black Sea is a military front in this war. And the Ukrainians, using US intelligence to get the coordinates for Ukrainian missiles, sunk the flagship of the Russian Black Sea fleet, appropriately named the Moskva, the Moscow. And this was in April. The symbolism was absolutely huge. The ship sank before it could be towed to port. Russian flagship sinks. And everybody in that part of the world got it. By the way, the Russian plan was to blockade the entire Black Sea coast and take the key port of Odessa to the west of Crimea. I give you a whole spiel on the history of Odessa. It's a fascinating place. They never got there on land. And eventually they agreed, under pressure from the UN, and Turkey brokered it, to allow Ukrainians to ship their grain out over the Black Sea in, I believe, August, after outcry from Egypt and other countries depend on shipments of Russian and Ukrainian wheat to keep the price of bread down far enough so there won't be a revolution. Okay. NATO and the European Union. And by the way, if you add Sweden and Finland to NATO, it's almost exactly the same as the European Union at this point. There are a few outliers. Norway is not an EU member, nor is Turkey, although they've applied, and so on. But basically, it's the same organization at this point. And, you know, the West did act together. Sanctions, weapons supply, intelligence sharing. Germany, key country. The Russians had counted on Germany to continue their policy of appeasement waffle and dependence on Russian gas. Didn't do it. Even under a new, untried chancellor of the Social Democratic Party, which had been always the most pro-Russian party in Germany. Now, the Germans are still reluctant to send Leopard tanks. You know, they have this aversion to getting involved in wars. Good for them. I wish more countries shared it, including Russia. But they've been moving very rapidly, I'll mention this later, to get Germany off Russian gas, which is actually much more important. And of course, the US demonstrated a certain diplomatic competence, which I think Putin and his advisors had not expected. Part of that was to act with the Europeans and never try to bully them or get ahead of them. And that's still true. So all of those things came together. By the way, did I mention that Stalin made the same mistake about the West right after the Second World War? He expected the West to fall apart, to start quarreling with each other over leftover empires, and the Americans would try to bully the Europeans, and the Europeans would reject it, and so on. I have some wonderful Soviet cartoons about that. And Stalin was just as surprised, I think, as Putin was that never happened. Okay, so we'll do the war in a nutshell. The beginning, Zelensky rallied the Ukrainians, not just him, but they rallied themselves. NATO refused the no-fly zone, which meant no direct participation on Ukrainian soil in the war. Keyword there is direct. The Russians made advances in Donbass in the east, but there were very few collaborators. All those little Russians who were going to come out, Russian speakers, and support Mother Russia simply failed to show. And they've still failed to show. In April through June, you got votes to send military aid all over the Western countries with almost no public dissent, which is interesting. Again, you always expect your enemy to have all kinds of dissent and opposition within. Never materialized in the West, hasn't materialized in Russia either, and we'll talk about that. The US sent these HIMARS rockets, which could go as far as the Russian artillery, which means you can hit the artillery command posts and munitions dumps, not just sit there and wait for the Russian artillery to shell you, as was happening before. And there's lots of military stuff that I don't understand all that well. If there are any people here who are real military buffs and understand all the weapon systems and how they work, you could tell us a lot more than I could. But anyway, the Russian advance stopped. Front line stabilized, and the Russians were taking very significant casualties. So, by the way, are the Ukrainians, but we don't hear as much about that. They were starting to scrounge soldiers from prisons, trying to get people to sign up as mercenaries. They have real trouble filling their volunteer army with what they call kontraktniki, contract soldiers, people who volunteer for pay, like our armed military. You volunteer, you sign up. You couldn't find them. Still can't. And Putin still downplayed this war as a special military operation. By the way, it's a crime in Russia still to talk about it as a war. That's called disrespecting the troops. You get 5 years or more for it. And then you get September. We're going to talk about September. September was amazing. The Ukrainians mounted a counteroffensive, and it went slowly in the south, Kherson, but it broke through with gains in that blue area you can see on the map in the north. By the way, there's an outfit called the Institute for the Study of War. If you want to follow day by day what's going on the military front, just go to the ISW website. They've got a map every day showing the changes and analysis to go with it. So the Ukrainians went on the offensive, and at least in that one area near Kharkiv, where, by the way, the Russians expected all the Russian speakers to become collaborators, never happened, broke through the Russian lines, couldn't quite do that in the south, but they're still pushing in the south. We'll see what happens. And here are the Ukrainians in Izium, a key road junction, supply route in Kharkiv province on the 16th of September. That's what, 11 days ago. And there were all kinds of reports of low Russian morale and troops cracking and all the rest of it. And again, I'm not sure what the reality is, but sometimes the perception becomes the reality. This wasn't supposed to happen. Russian troops were not supposed to crack and run, as they apparently did to some degree. And they had trouble filling. Some of the Russian units, by the way, lost 2/3 of their personnel over this whole period, and they just haven't been able to fill the ranks. War crimes. At the same place at Izium, they exhumed something like 300, 400 bodies. Earlier, it was Bucha near Kiev. other places. And the UN, the Secretary General Guterres, he's called for a war crimes investigation by the International Criminal Court. Now, this doesn't sound like much. Americans sort of diss this kind of thing. Europeans pay very close attention to it. Understand, they're the ones who are for human rights in the world. That's how they see themselves. And people say, well, Europeans, they're just wishy-washy and they're going to give in to the gas blackmail and the rest. No. Europeans, as far as I can tell, are really, really angry about the coming again of war, about potential war crimes and actual war crimes, about the shelling of civilians and apartment buildings. This is not what the world is about. It's not what we're about. They have that reaction, I think, much more strongly than Americans do. You know, we've been involved in the war on terror, various other things, often not much to our credit. So anyway, now, why through all of this did Russians not rebel? There's been an awful lot of wishful thinking about that in the media. And every time there's a demonstration, oh my, Russia's about to boil over and the mobs are going to come out in the streets and run a color revolution and get rid of Putin and so on. Forget it. It's wishful thinking. Why? Because, in fact, Putin has always had a social contract with the Russian people. And it's really quite simple. You stay out of politics, don't make trouble, go about your business, go get your kids an ice cream cone, take a holiday in Turkey. Wonderful. I'll take care of business. Okay, that's the social contract. Don't mess with the state. And it's worked. Now, along with that, think about Russians. Plain old patriotism. Very strong, always has been. Come on, how many people in this country really objected to things that we did that weren't so nice? By the way, one of the few really true things that Donald Trump said is, you think we're so innocent? Anyway, they're patriots. And we Russians, I'll talk like a Russian here, we get it that America and NATO control Ukraine and they want to control Russia. Okay, that's what we're told. Putin, well, we believe in him. He knows what he's doing. He's attending to business. It's just a special military operation, so what me worry? And Putin has support, as most conservatives everywhere in the world do, in smaller towns, smaller cities, rural areas, older people. The sociology of support for Putin isn't very much different from elsewhere in that regard. It's the young, educated, liberal folks in big urban centers, predominantly Moscow and St. Petersburg, who tend to be the dissenters, the tradition of the Russian intelligentsia. My life is normal, you know, why get involved? You know, sanctions are annoying, but I can still buy a burger at McDonald's, which is made by a Russian company. Love it or leave it. Don't like Russia, leave. Well, estimate 300,000 young, mostly young educated people left by September. They say 80,000 casualties. Come on, fake news, American disinformation. And of course, there have been no official reports of casualties or low morale or anything like that. And there are no media outlets in Russia that are able to broadcast any of this. So I don't think it's all that mysterious why there was no mass opposition or rebellion in Russia until recently. And I'll mention just one incident here. Alla Pugacheva. Now, she was a Soviet, late Soviet, Gorbachev era pop idol. Everybody listened to her. Think somebody like Dolly Parton, maybe. I mean, if you want a contemporary in age and popularity, you know, and appealing to ordinary people, not to sophisticated urban audiences. Her husband was labeled a foreign agent, an ino-agent. An ino is an interesting prefix in Russian. It means other. inostranci are people from other countries. So think of othering, the other, whenever you see that term. And anybody who is influenced by foreign organizations or propaganda, Western ones presumably, can be labeled a foreign agent. You don't have to accept money. You don't have to have an organizational connection. Just be influenced by it, which means pretty much blanket everybody. Well, this happened to Pugachova's husband. And she said, look, going to make him a foreign agent. You can declare me one as well. And this whole thing is a bunch of illusions. And it was an interesting event. By the way, the Russians are now inching toward a kind of atmosphere of vigilance and all of that, which reminds me a lot of Stalin. It's not to that level. There's no gulag, there's no mass purge, but some of the rhetoric is edging pretty rapidly in that direction. By the way, I would also say pop stars in this era of the entertainment age really matter. Zelensky was a comedian. Okay, now I'm going to do a quick detour into the international side. Just before the invasion, and it's not clear how much China knew about it before it happened, just not clear, I don't know. Xi Jinping and Putin announced a partnership with no limits. No limits. Well, what's happened since? Chinese haven't sent any money, except their payment for oil. They haven't sent any military supplies. They've been honoring sanctions. Their companies don't want to get blacklisted in America or Europe. And they've been buying a lot of Russian oil on the cheap, as much as a 30% discount. So Russians can't sell it anywhere else. They can't sell it to Europe, so they sell it to the Chinese and the Indians, and they discount it, which, by the way, is one reason there are now downward pressures on the oil price, world oil price, which is going down. One reason is other people have to match these Russian discounts. In any case, they still continue their already scheduled military cooperation. It's not that they've thrown the Russians under the bus, but Xi and Putin met in Uzbekistan in September. Putin then said that China had concerns about the war. Now, I'm not sure why Putin said that. Maybe they'd agreed ahead of time that Putin would be the one to say it, rather than having Xi Jinping say it. But they insisted. Now, there's been a lot of talk about China. China gains absolutely nothing by becoming involved in this situation. Certainly not becoming involved on the Russian side. Their economy is hurting. They've got drought all over the place. They've got COVID to cope with. And above all, they need European and American markets. Hey, let the others fight and pick up the pieces. It's what we always do, and it serves us very, very well. Win or lose, Russia will become more of a vassal. That's a term used by Russian commentators, by the way, including pro-government ones, to China. And that's a good outcome. They'll become dependent on us as the place to ship their oil and gas and various other things, and they'll buy our products. And we have lots of different sources, by the way, of oil and gas, so we're not going to be dependent on them at all, and that's a good outcome for us, Chinese. The Russian idea of this limitless partnership was a kind of world condominium with the Russians doing the military stuff and the Chinese doing the economic stuff, and that's dead as a doornail. Probably always was a kind of a pipe dream. Very unequal partnership. Look at those GDP figures. Now, those are world prices, and the Russian figure will go up and down with the oil price. If you do them purchasing power, actually doesn't help the Russians much, helps the Chinese number. Chinese economy in total is larger than the American economy in purchasing power at the moment. They also have 4 times as many people. But anyway, and then look at the comparison on the bottom, China, or Russia and NATO. I mean, this is no contest. And the Russians know it. And there's the hookup for the 30% discount. The oil pipeline is now working, but they've just started work on the natural gas pipeline, which is needed if the Europeans really aren't going to be using Russian natural gas. You have to have a way to send it places. And there's no pipeline to China. Okay. What about the energy weapon? Well, the EU countries have decided that they're not going to buy any more Russian oil after February the 5th coming up. And they're not going to buy any seaborne cargoes after December, so that there won't be any more coming in after the 5th of February. That's huge. The Germans, again, they're maybe not sending tanks, but they this month nationalized Unipro, which is a Russian-connected gas distribution company. They're getting along without the Russian gas. They canceled Nord Stream 2, the pipeline. The Russians just shut down Nord Stream 1. Now, maybe they'll reopen it again, but they've shut it down at the moment. And the Germans are scrambling for new supplies of gas, including from the United States. LNG, liquid natural gas, shipped to Germany. And most interesting is that there's no popular push in Germany for an Ostpolitik, an appeasement of Russia, a peace through trade, all the rest of this traditional stuff, which I would argue served Germany very, very well in the past. But at the moment, no. And the most popular political party in Germany now are the Greens. What do they represent? Very strong emphasis on human rights. Go back to those bodies at Izium and the criminal court, and getting off fossil fuels, which is, of course, what's happening. Ukrainian refugees have been welcomed, in contrast to Middle Eastern ones. Poland, Moldova, Lithuania, other places. We don't know how many are going to go back or when. There's no real data I've found on that. And yes, we got a right-wing leader in Italy, but she, unlike her partners Salvini and Berlusconi, saying she supports NATO, she supports the war in or aid to the Ukrainians, she is not going to take Italy off the bus in that sense, which is very important. That's one of the reasons she got elected. Now, a note on sanctions. They generally stiffen resistance, and whoever is sanctioned tries to find workarounds. Well, if you think of Russian threats to shut off gas to Germany and Europe as a form of sanctions, that's exactly what's happened. It's stiffened resistance, so they're finding workarounds. Just the way they're serving Russian company burgers at the former McDonald's, or I don't know, whatever the Iranians do. This is how sanctions work. They can have a very important longer-term economic effect. And they can inhibit key kinds of production, including military production, if you don't have the right computer chips. But in terms of the politics, they don't create regime change, they create resistance and workarounds. This has happened in the case of Russian gas to Europe, just as much as in the reverse direction. And then we have the other countries that don't take sides, which should be no surprise. Indonesia, Egypt, India, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, the whole bunch. It's not their neighborhood. How many of you wake up in the morning gnashing your teeth about Yemen or Ethiopia? Really, no kidding. And they reject a whole lot of the US rhetoric about democracy, or the European rhetoric for that matter, given the US interventions, the history of European imperialism, the whole 9 yards that we won't bother to go into right now. Turkey sent drones, which helped stop the invasion of its tracks at the beginning. India has begun to criticize the war. Egypt and others need the wheat exports that finally came out. The tilt is now away from Russia very clearly. We have the war crimes investigation. Zelensky was invited to speak to the UN General Assembly. That was very important. Now, if the United States pitched the war in terms of national independence against imperialism, we'd have a much more receptive world audience. And Biden began to do that in his speech at the UN on the 21st of September. And then finally, on the international side, let's note the one thing that the whole world thinks about, but nobody much says, what's going to happen if Donald Trump returns as president? And I say specifically Trump. It's not clear that other conservative Republicans would behave internationally the same way. But very clearly, the United States would opt out of the Ukraine situation and others like it. And by the way, if you want a T-shirt that says, I'd rather be a Russian than a Democrat, you can buy one on Amazon for $17.99, but it's black, and I checked this morning. Okay. So, September 20 situation. Ukrainians are on the offensive. The Russians don't have soldiers. Military aid is still pouring in from the West. The Germans have not responded to the energy weapon of Russia. Sweden and Finland have joined NATO. China and India are expressing doubts. China's on the fence. And nationalist ultras in Russia are openly criticizing the special military operation as a failure and are urging escalation. That's September 20th. And that, of course, is the morning of September 21st, less than a week ago. Look at the expression on Mr. Putin's face. The telephones, by the way, are also interesting. Ever since Stalin's time, having this telephone on your desk has been a symbol of top authority in Russia. Just take a good look at him. And here's what he said. It's the West and the Americans who are creating all the trouble in Ukraine. Didn't even mention Ukraine very much. They're just pawns and puppets, proxies. We're going to have these referendums in the 4 southern regions, basically that old Novorossiya area. And although he didn't say so, the plan is obviously to annex these as part of Russia on the Crimea model. Mobilization. Later, they announced there were going to be 300,000 called up, mostly reservists, but it could be expanded, and it's not even clear how that's going to play out in terms of who's getting called or how many. And then we will escalate if there's any attack on Russian territory. Now, do these annexed provinces constitute Russian territory? And then Putin says, quote, "We will certainly make use of all weapon systems available to us. This is not a bluff." Nukes. Now, if Putin could get away with this, it's a victory. The referendums, by the way, aren't for you and me. They're to convince Russians at home in a situation of controlled information flow. Mobilization, justified as defense of Russia and Russians, including the new ones in Ukraine. And of course, you're asking Russians to buy the idea that they're going to risk their lives and world war to defend these newly liberated Russian provinces. That's a tall order. Here's some of the referendum propaganda. Russia is here forever. Russians and Ukrainians. One people, a united whole. Kherson, ironic, Kherson is under attack from the Ukrainians at the moment. Forever with Russia. Smiling children, lots of smiling children. And by the way, in the background on this poster on the left, it's like the first slide I showed you. There's this little hint of the Ukrainian flag back there. These posters are not, how should we say, casually put together. Here's the voting on the referendum. I found this picture. I liked it. Note the transparent box. Okay. If the ballot is a single sheet of paper, you can get a photograph of that. Yes, no, drop it in the transparent box. Enough said. Plans for denazification of Ukraine. Now, there was an article on August 9th, semi-official articles pulled after 2 days, talking in more extreme terms than this slide about what would be in store for Ukrainians when they were being denazified. Become Russian citizens subject to Russian law, going to purge government and civic organizations, punish soldiers and officials. The article mentioned deporting them to Russian prison camps. All schools will be taught in Russian. Children, as well as their parents, will be Russified. You need a whole generation to pull that off. And then what about the refugees? Well, millions have fled. I suppose they can either return and become Russian or forfeit their property, something like that. Some of you may get the vibe of the Palestinians' creation of Israel. You know, if you fled, your property is forfeit. Somebody else can have it. Okay. So we don't know how much of this in what way is actually going to be carried out. We do have this official article that talks about it in more, as I say, more extreme terms than this slide does, and everything seems to be going pretty much that way. These are Russian prisoners being paraded in Donetsk under Russian occupation. This is technically a crime under international law, by the way, we're parading prisoners around. And then finally, mobilization. Has Putin broken the social contract? I take care of business, you go about your lives, don't make trouble. Well, if you were a Russian and you listen to Putin's speech, you're not dumb. Russians are very smart. They may not have the same sources of information, but they're very smart. They know what's going on. They're well educated. Hey, okay, this is obviously a real war. Obviously, we're losing. Do we really have 80,000 casualties already? Maybe I better check. I don't want to be drafted. I don't want my kids to be drafted. I don't want my husband to be drafted. Are we really going to die for new Russian provinces in Ukraine? And first, this guy told us to be quiet, special military operation, and let him handle it, and then he needs us. Maybe he's not that smart. What about war against NATO? We know what he meant by that last sentence. And we also know that the Americans and others are no wimps. Hey, nuclear bombs can go off here too. Okay. Pileups at the borders. Estimates may be exaggerated, 260,000 trying to leave. Note, by the way, this is a crowd trying to walk across the border between Russia and Georgia. Charlotte and I were there at that spot a couple of years ago, up in the pass through the Caucasus Mountains. Look at the faces, draft age men. And you're not going to wait 3 days for the traffic jam to clear out. You get out of your car and walk across. Now, by the way, one other thing I would mention for Americans, we had the same effect during the Vietnam War. It was when the draft was announced that was going to hit college students and other peoples that the anti-war movement really took off in this country. That was what did it. So we don't know. Most will comply, but you've got protests. And I took this picture of mothers in Dagestan. The committees of soldiers' mothers have always been important for 30 years now. Afghan war, Chechen war, Russia. They're a potent political force. And I don't think they exist formally anymore, but the idea that Mother Russia is going to be protesting a draft is a powerful idea. And it's starting to happen. Note, by the way, the Russians are recruiting most heavily in minority areas. Chechnya has sent all of its soldiers already, Ramzan Kadyrov. Dagestan, which is an Islamic area in the Caucasus next to Chechnya, Buryatia, which is an ethnic Mongol area north of Mongolia. Empires, by the way, always round up people who are ethnic minorities, not their core population, to fight their wars. This is a very old story. Think Gurkhas. And the Russians are doing that. Now, the experts think that even this mobilization isn't going to produce very many good soldiers, and certainly not for a while. It may just flop completely or not. We don't know. We'll have to wait and see. And I'm going to finish up here in about 2 or 3 minutes. Look at this list of uncertainties. And what I would say, by the way, there are far too many moving parts at this point for anybody to make any predictions. Far too many. If you're a decision maker, if you have power, you can try to influence these things. But if you're sitting here just looking at it and asking what the heck's going to happen, trying to take all of this into account, the only sensible, intelligent answer is, I don't know. Look at the list. Military uncertainties. Can the Ukrainians advance? Will the conscription produce good Russian soldiers? What will happen with weapons supply to Ukraine? What will happen to Russian military production capability as the chips run out? They were rumored to try to buy munitions from North Korea. The North Koreans denied it. Doesn't mean they didn't send them. And they have bought drones from Iran. What does that say about vaunted Russian military production capability? In Russia, Putin's credibility, resistance to conscription, effective sanctions. We don't know. We just don't know. Western solidarity. There are going to be some cold German kitchens this winter. We've got all this inflation, partly due to oil prices and gas prices, although those are going down now, which is very interesting. Anybody here really knows about the oil business, you could explain that to me. We have the right-wing governments, and the House of Representatives, if it goes Republican in a couple of weeks, 6 weeks, may start to put the brakes on U.S. help to Ukraine. We'll see. Maybe not. And of course, the reaction to the Russian nuclear threats. And what are the Russians going to do? Just bomb and shell everything in Ukraine, use nuclear weapons? Not clear. It's not clear how other countries will react to anything on the above part of the list as it happens. Okay, we're at a very fluid point. Here's an expert at the Belfer Center at Harvard, who is of Ukrainian origin, has her undergraduate degree from the university in Ukraine, says Putin could very easily resort to nuclear weapons on the territory of Ukraine or blow up a Ukrainian nuclear plant, think Chernobyl, to try to shock the Ukraine into surrender. Not unthinkable. Now, nuclear blackmail. Can it work? In the United States, there are some conservatives calling for peace, a peace deal that would give Russia some territory. Not clear how much. I'd like to have your comments and opinions on the nuclear blackmail issue, nuclear threat issue, if you want to use that term. But I would argue that we should remind ourselves of some history. The folks on the left have met in Munich first week of October 1938 to consider Hitler's demand that he get a little piece of Czechoslovakia. It's a faraway country. You can have a little piece of it, said Neville Chamberlain, going home to London and proclaiming peace in our time to cheering crowds. Okay. On the right, Stalin in the background. Germany and Russia signed a non-aggression treaty, which had a secret clause, protocol, which I read in college 60 years ago, but Russians couldn't read until 1989, dividing Eastern Europe between the Nazis and Stalin. Now, both of these represent, in a sense, the same thing. They represent big countries getting together over the heads of small ones to decide their fate. We want to repeat that history? Think about it. Finally, why is a negotiated peace so difficult? Well, Putin's dug in, he's gambled, he's doubled down, his prestige and Russia's prestige, and his hold on power on the line. Ukraine. If you were Zelensky, could you just sort of come out tomorrow morning? Oh, I think we'll talk to the Russians about giving a piece of our country to the orcs. It's their, it's like gooks. It's their slang for Russian soldiers. Oh, how long would he last? Well, I think Anthony Blinken actually put it well. If Russia stops fighting, the war ends, and if Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends. That's basically right. Although the war ends and Putin ends may be added to the comment about Russia. So far, there's no move to sell out Ukraine, but there's also no effective outside power to compel negotiations, which is how some wars end. Okay, I'll stop there and let's have questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your presentation and time. What are your thoughts on Putin's health?
I have no idea. What are your thoughts? I'd love to have comments.
The facial edema looks like maybe steroids, or rumors of leukemia or some other type of bloodborne cancer. Right. Just like, wonder if you have any thoughts.
No, I don't. And it would take a medical professional who we both trusted to give us anything that would even come close to decent information or speculation about that. By the way, one of the things I've tried to learn, sometimes not well enough, is if you don't know something, don't speculate about it. You know, you should try to know what the questions are and maybe sometimes what the alternatives or the options are. But as a matter of, in this case, fact, you don't know, you say so. That's why I had that whole list of uncertainties. You could add Putin's health to that list.
Have some questions online. I'll come over here so people can hear me online too. So, careful. Who's closer, this is from Nat Fenton, who's closer to Nazis or fascists? Ukraine, Russia, Hungary, Sweden, Italy, Poland, France, Republicans.
I keep that list going.
Okay.
It's a moving target. I think probably the hardliners around Putin at this point come closer than anybody else. After that, I would put, let's see, who else was on that list? Orban,
Ukraine,
Trump.
Russia, Hungary, Sweden, Italy, Poland, France.
I would put Orban of Hungary and US Trumpist Republicans next on that list after Putin and his advisors. I wouldn't have put Putin first, by the way, a year ago. It's what's happened since. He's a, as I say, very traditional Russian leader, and traditional Russian leaders can vary quite a bit in how, nasty they are. Some of them aren't.
Given Ukrainian position for the restoration of its pre-2014 borders and recompense plus war trials, are any scenarios for a graceful Putin exit? Are there? How does this end without Putin's demise?
Well, it ends without Putin's demise. Let me take those questions from the back going the other way. If, in fact, he can get something that he can say was a victory, no matter how small. Some slice of Ukrainian territory, maybe even just keeping what he had before, but getting the rest of the world to recognize the annexation of Crimea and that small piece of Donbass. That would be the absolute minimum that I think would have him be solid in power. And by the way, Crimea really is a Russian area more than a Ukrainian one. I could go on and on about that. If you held a referendum there now, and you could under UN or Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe auspices, a real one, I suspect they would vote Russia, not Ukraine. I'm not sure what difference that makes. At some point, you don't do just legal niceties. But anyway,
so you want to?
I think anything that looks like the pre-2014 borders and war trials involving Russians, Putin's gone. That's the point about why the negotiated peace is so difficult. You basically, as a questioner, have hit that nail right on the head.
Last one here. You noted that the Russian Orthodox Patriarch is subservient to Putin. What role does the Orthodox Church currently have in the Ukraine and going forward?
That's really complicated. And again, I don't know as much as I should. The Ukrainian church, Orthodox Church, dissociated itself from the patriarch in Moscow. This was some years ago. And the patriarch in Moscow never accepted it. Now, I don't think there are a whole lot of super religious Ukrainians. And I don't think there are a whole lot who would let religious ideas influence their nationalism. Well, nationalism is much more powerful at this point. But there's been this split in the church. There's also the tradition in Western Ukraine of the Greek Catholics or Uniate Church, which follow the Orthodox Rite, but long, long ago, centuries ago, accepted the Pope as the head of Christianity. And how that's being played at the moment, and whether people there, who some of them quite religious, regard things, I'm not sure. But they would be very strongly anti-Russian, probably, as they are generally in Western Ukraine. Very good question. I'll see if I can go do some more research. Yes, sir.
You spoke to this a little bit, but to what extent do you think the reaction to Chechnya, Crimea, and Syria, Russian engagement there, or lack of response emboldened Putin to think?
Right. You could add Georgia 2008 to that list. I didn't mention it, but I, easily could have. I think it changed a lot in the thinking, or influenced the thinking in Russia quite a bit. Wishful thinking, that they're really not going to react no matter what we do, and they'll just split and splinter. Probably the idea that Russia could save the Assad regime when the United States and the Obama administration refused to intervene to overthrow it had a significant effect. I think the most significant effect was the mess in Afghanistan a year ago in August. And Chechnya, not so much. That was within the Russian Federation. And by the way, at that point, the Russians were our allies on the war on terror, and the Chechens were becoming increasingly jihadist and Islamist. But I think, they saw all this and they said, oh yeah, they're not going to do very much. Yes, sir.
Do you have any thoughts about how Putin's invasion might impact Xi Jinping's relationship with Taiwan?
As you know, a tremendous amount of ink spilled on that one recently. Yeah. And this was my last slide, which I'll do a little of. Yeah, let's go this way. Reasons for optimism. One of them is that it's a clear demonstration that short, victorious wars sometimes don't end like that. And I think it'll make the Chinese think twice before they go and invade Taiwan, because they are perfectly well aware that all sorts of things can happen that they hadn't thought of ahead of time. That's one of the real lessons of all of this. So I think probably it has an inhibiting effect, as does the fact that their vaunted Russian allies so far have pretty much taken it on the chin, although they've certainly occupied some territory in Ukraine, and the demonstration of unity against Russia on the part of others. Now, if I were Chinese, all of that would make me go a little slow. But I don't know. I'm not Xi Jinping, and you'd have to ask him. I don't know. What do you think?
I would agree. Yeah, it might be a little bit more, skeptical to move in as quickly as they might have planned, but
right.
Probably inevitable.
Right. The other argument, which maybe you would make, or certainly some people make, is that China has kind of hit peak China. The economic growth rate is going down rapidly. They've got all these internal problems. They clearly aren't going to become the world technological leaders by 2025, the way they'd hoped a few years ago. And they better get going while the getting's good. That's the counter argument. But that predates the war in Ukraine and its lessons. I'm not sure how much the Ukraine events have changed that notion.
I think we're at about time. Oh, we have one more?
Well, I just wondered, there's been fighting between Ukrainian and Russians. There's the Ukrainian separatists that wanted to join Russia for several years now. And I'm wondering if there was an agreement and all this, there were borderlines that were settled. Would that still go on? Would that be well?
Yeah. Well, this is part of the problem. And you know, we could go back to the first part of your comment, but you know, would you settle anything by setting borders? My answer is no. You really wouldn't. If you gave a piece of Ukraine to Russia, the Ukrainians would be extremely angry, and they could, you know, start doing partisans and sabotage and assassinations, which they're already doing to some extent. And if you somehow shoehorned the Russians back to where they were a year ago, or even further out, those small enclaves in Donbass that they recognized as separate states, well, they would be asking, what the heck is all of this for? Who stabbed us in the back? See, somebody's going to argue that we were stabbed in the back by somebody, no matter what happens. So I don't think that any drawing of lines, that's one of the reasons this is such a tough situation, is really going to settle much of anything. And then you go back to the draft treaties, and Ukraine isn't a real country, and Ukraine has become a real country with its recent nationalism, and you know. So I don't think you can just carve it up and say you're going to end it that way. Thank you all very much.